Clara didn't just hear the whispers, she felt them. Every hammer strike against rusted corrugated tin drew cruel sneers from the wealthy neighbors next door. They called her crazy. They called her scrap wood monstrosity a pathetic eyesore. But when the great freeze hit, their mocking laughter died, buried under 8 feet of snow. Oak Haven, Colorado, was not a town that forgave weakness. Nestled high in the unforgiving cradle of the Rocky Mountains, it was a place where winter didn't just arrive, it invaded. For 32 years, Clara Higgins and her husband Arthur had held the line against those winters in a modest, cedar-shingled A-frame cabin. They weren't wealthy, but Arthur was resourceful, a retired mechanical engineer who understood how to make a little heat go a long way. Then came the sudden, catastrophic heart attack in late August. Arthur was gone before the ambulance even navigated the winding dirt road leading to their property. Clara, at 64, was left with a mountain of medical debt, a dwindling savings account, and a cabin that suddenly felt cavernous and drafty. Worse, she was left with the terrifying reality of an Oak Haven winter approaching, and she had no money for the exorbitant winter propane deliveries. Her only lifeline was the 10 cords of oak and pine Arthur had chopped before his death. But there was a problem. He hadn't finished building the woodshed. The wood was stacked against the north side of the cabin, exposed to the elements, and much of it was still too green to burn efficiently unless it was kept perfectly, immaculately dry. And then there were the Carmichaels. Bill and Brenda Carmichael had moved from Silicon Valley 2 years prior, buying up the 3 acres adjacent to Clara's plot. They had immediately bulldozed the natural pine grove to erect a sprawling, multi-million-dollar modern lodge made almost entirely of steel and triple-paned glass. They drove matching imported SUVs and viewed Clara's rustic, aging cabin as a blight on their panoramic mountain views. "It's just a matter of time, Brenda," Clara heard Bill say one afternoon in late September. Clara had been kneeling in her garden, pulling up the last of the dead tomato vines, when Bill's voice drifted over the low stone wall separating their properties. "The old bird won't survive the winter. The estate will sell for pennies on the dollar, and we can finally bulldoze that shack and put in the infinity pool." The sheer callousness of the words struck Clara like a physical blow. She didn't cry. The tears had all been spent at Arthur's funeral. Instead, a cold, hard ember of defiance ignited in her chest. She wasn't going to freeze, and she certainly wasn't going to surrender her home to a man who wore designer loafers in the mountains. Clara retreated to the cabin and pulled out Arthur's old leather-bound notebooks. He had been obsessed with passive solar heating and structural efficiency. In the back of a journal dated 2012, she found a series of sketches labeled The Envelope Strategy. Arthur had theorized that instead of just insulating the walls of a house, one could build a secondary, uninsulated shell around the windward sides. This shed would act as a massive windbreak, trapping a layer of dead air that would dramatically reduce heat loss from the main structure. Furthermore, if the firewood was stored inside this envelope, the ambient heat escaping the cabin would dry the green wood perfectly, while the woodpile itself would act as thermal mass. It was brilliant. It was also going to be incredibly ugly. Clara had exactly $240 to her name after paying the property taxes. She couldn't afford lumber, so she became a scavenger. She drove her battered 1998 Ford Ranger to the county dump, to abandoned barns, and to demolition sites down in the valley. She hauled back rotting, moss-covered fence posts, discarded shipping pallets, twisted sheets of corrugated aluminum, and mismatched, peeling wooden doors. By mid-October, the construction began. Clara worked from sunrise to sunset, her arthritic fingers numb with the dropping temperatures. She started erecting a massive, ramshackle lean-to that extended 12 feet out from the entire northern and western walls of her cabin. The Carmichaels noticed immediately. One evening, as Clara was struggling to hoist a heavy, splintered slab of plywood onto the rudimentary framing, Brenda Carmichael strolled to the property line, clutching a steaming mug of expensive coffee. "Clara, dear," Brenda called out, her voice dripping with toxic, performative concern. "What on earth are you doing? Are you building a shanty town?" Clara paused, wiping sweat mixed with sawdust from her forehead. "I'm building a woodshed, Brenda. Winter is coming." "A woodshed?" Bill had stepped out onto his heated patio, laughing loudly. "Clara, that looks like a landfill threw up on your house. You're encasing half your cabin in actual garbage. What about your property values? What about our property values?" "My property values don't keep me warm at night, Bill," Clara replied evenly, picking up her hammer. The mockery didn't stop there. Bill took photos of Clara's makeshift shed and posted them to the Oak Haven community Facebook group under the guise of worrying about an elderly neighbor's mental health. The comments were ruthless. People speculated that grief had driven the widow insane. They called her a hoarder. When Clara went into town to buy nails at Tobias Boone's hardware store, conversations stopped. People pointed. They snickered behind their hands. But Clara kept building. She walled in the 10 cords of wood. She sealed the gaps in the corrugated tin with cheap spray foam and stuffed discarded fiberglass insulation she'd found in a dumpster into the corners. By the first week of November, the monstrosity was complete. It looked like a post-apocalyptic bunker strapped to the side of a quaint mountain cabin. It was an eyesore. But when Clara stepped inside the dark, cavernous space between the scrap metal outer wall and her cabin's siding, she noticed something immediately. The biting autumn wind vanished. The air was still, quiet and distinctly warmer. Bill Carmichael was not a man who tolerated being ignored. When his public shaming on social media failed to stop Clara, he escalated the situation. He wanted the structure gone, and he wanted Clara broken. On a freezing Tuesday morning in late November, a white county vehicle crunched up Clara's gravel driveway. A tall, weary-looking man with a clipboard stepped out. It was Gregory Finch, the regional building code enforcer. Clara met him on the porch, a sickening knot forming in her stomach. "Mrs. Higgins," Gregory said, looking up at the towering patchwork of pallets, tin, and mismatched doors that swallowed half the cabin. He let out a long, heavy sigh. "I've received multiple complaints. They're calling it an illegal, unpermitted addition. I have to do an inspection." "It's not an addition, Mr. Finch," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain firm. "It's a temporary agricultural outbuilding for wood storage, and there is no poured foundation." Gregory followed Clara into the shed. He clicked on a flashlight, illuminating the massive walls of stacked firewood. He tapped the dirt floor with his boot, noting the lack of concrete. He looked at the framing, which, while ugly, was structurally sound. Arthur had taught her well how to brace a load-bearing beam. "Mrs. Higgins," Gregory said quietly, turning off his flashlight. "I knew Arthur. He was a good man. And honestly, this structure, it exploits a very specific loophole in the county bylaws. Because it's not physically attached to the load-bearing studs of your main dwelling, has no plumbing, no foundation, and is used strictly for fuel storage, I can't legally make you tear it down." Clara exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for a month. "However," Gregory continued, his expression grim, "Bill Carmichael is furious. He's threatening to sue the county. He's threatening to call the EPA, claiming you're leaching chemicals from those treated railroad ties into the groundwater. He's going to make your life a living hell, Clara. Is this really worth it? You could sell this place, move down to a nice condo in Denver." "This is my home, Gregory," Clara said, her eyes flashing. "Arthur built this cabin. I will not be bullied out of it by a man who thinks money buys him the right to dictate my survival." Gregory nodded slowly, writing something on his clipboard. "The structure is compliant. Barely. But compliant. Good luck, Mrs. Higgins. The almanac is predicting a brutal season." When Bill Carmichael found out the county refused to act, his petty cruelty intensified. He installed high-powered, motion-sensor security floodlights on the edge of his property and aimed them directly at Clara's bedroom windows, claiming they were for her safety. Brenda started leaving aggressive care packages on Clara's doorstep. Cheap, thin blankets from the dollar store with passive-aggressive notes reading, "Since you clearly can't afford proper heating, hoping this helps. Let us know when you're ready to sell." The psychological warfare took a toll. There were nights Clara sat in her armchair by the cold wood stove, rubbing her blistered, scarred hands, weeping silently into the silence of the cabin. She was so tired. The doubt crept in. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was just a crazy old widow clinging to garbage. But then she would look at Arthur's urn on the mantel. She would remember the blueprint. She would walk into the enclosed shed, smell the rich, earthy scent of the oak drying in the trapped ambient heat, and her resolve would harden like steel. By the second week of December, the sky over Oak Haven changed. It didn't just turn grey, it turned a bruised, heavy purple. The local news anchors lost their cheerful banter. Meteorologists began using phrases like historic pressure drop, polar vortex, and bomb cyclone. A massive, slow-moving front of Arctic air was colliding with deep Pacific moisture directly over the Rockies. The town went into a panic. The grocery store shelves were stripped bare in hours. The propane delivery companies issued a statement. Due to the impending road conditions and a regional shortage, they were suspending all residential deliveries indefinitely. You had what you had in your tank. On December 14th, Clara woke up to an eerie, deadened silence. The temperature inside her cabin was a comfortable 68 degrees, but when she looked out her kitchen window, her breath hitched. The world had disappeared. A wall of blinding, howling white violence was tearing across the mountain. The wind was screaming, a literal, high-pitched shriek that shook the heavy timbers of her cabin. The local radio station crackled with static before the announcer's panicked voice broke through. "Blizzard warning upgraded to a state of emergency. Sustained winds at 70 miles per hour. Wind chill is 50 below zero. Do not go outside. Repeat, do not leave your homes. Power grids are failing across the county." Clara watched through the glass as the Carmichaels' massive house across the property line flickered. Their exterior landscape lighting strobed wildly for 3 seconds. Then the power went out. The entire mountain plunged into darkness. Clara walked over to her wood stove. She opened the heavy cast-iron door. Inside, a bed of red-hot coals glowed brightly. She walked over to the interior door that led directly into her scrapwood shed. When she opened it, she wasn't met with a blast of 50 below zero wind. She was met with still air, remarkably insulated by the massive wall of firewood and the ugly, patched-together barrier she had bled to build. She grabbed 2 logs of perfectly dry, seasoned oak, placed them on the coals, and watched as they immediately burst into bright, life-saving flames. Next door, the Carmichaels' glass mansion, completely exposed to the shrieking Arctic wind, was about to become a very beautiful, very expensive freezer. Nature possesses a horrifying indifference to human wealth, As the bomb cyclone stalled directly over the Oakhaven Ridge, the temperature plummeted from 20 degrees to -32 in less than 4 hours. Factoring in the sustained 80-mile-per-hour wind gusts, the wind chill hovered near a lethal 70 below zero. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it consumed. It crystallized the moisture in the lungs and turned the very air into shattered glass. Inside her cabin, Clara sat in Arthur's old leather recliner, a steaming mug of black tea resting on her lap. The contrast between the violent apocalypse outside and the steady, radiating warmth of her living room was almost surreal. The heavy cast-iron wood stove ticked and pinged as it consumed the bone-dry oak. Arthur's envelope strategy was performing a miracle. The howling wind slammed against the patchwork outer wall of corrugated tin and discarded pallets, but the force was entirely absorbed by that sacrificial layer. The 12-foot gap of dead air between the shed's exterior and Clara's actual cabin wall acted as an impenetrable thermal buffer. Furthermore, the heat bleeding through her uninsulated cabin walls wasn't being snatched away by the wind. It was being captured inside the shed. When Clara needed more wood, she didn't have to put on a parka, boots, and goggles to face the deadly whiteout. She simply walked in her slippers through the interior side door into the dark, cavernous lean-to. It was chilly inside the shed, perhaps 40 degrees, but it was profoundly still. The massive stacks of firewood acted as a thermal mass, absorbing the escaped heat and drying out perfectly. She pulled 3 logs from the stack, carried them inside, and fed the fire. It was effortless survival. Next door, the situation was rapidly devolving into a fight for life. Bill Carmichael paced the length of his sprawling, open-concept living room, a cell phone pressed to his ear. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows, which usually offered a breathtaking view of the valley, were entirely opaque, plastered with a thick layer of rime ice. Without the ambient sunlight to provide passive solar gain, the glass was acting as a massive thermal bleed. The house was hemorrhaging heat. "What do you mean you can't get a crew up here?" Bill barked into the phone, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the powerless mansion. On the other end of the line, Caroline Hayes, the weary emergency dispatcher for the county, tried to maintain her professionalism. "Mr. Carmichael, I have explained this 3 times. The state highways are completely impassable. Deputy Miller attempted to push up Ridge Road with a modified snowcat, and he nearly went into a ravine. We have whiteout conditions and falling trees. The power grid has suffered a catastrophic cascading failure. You are entirely on your own for at least the next 48 hours. Conserve your heat and stay away from the windows." The line went dead. Bill threw the phone onto a leather sofa in frustration. "Bill!" Brenda's voice trembled. She was huddled under 3 expensive cashmere throws on an accent chair, her breath pluming in white clouds in the dim light of a single battery-powered camping lantern. "Why hasn't the backup generator kicked on? You said the generator would run the whole house." "It's the regulator," Bill snapped, running a hand through his hair. The propane company didn't winterize the valve for this kind of temperature drop. The condensation inside the line froze solid. The engine is starved for fuel. It's completely dead. "Well, fix it," Brenda cried, her voice rising in panic. "It is 45 degrees in here, Bill. My fingers are numb." Bill had tried. 2 hours earlier, he had bundled up in his designer ski gear and ventured out to the concrete pad where the massive commercial generator sat. He had lasted exactly 4 minutes. The wind had instantly ripped his expensive goggles from his face, and the agonizing, burning sensation of the extreme cold had driven him back inside before he could even unlatch the generator's housing. By midnight, the temperature inside the glass mansion dropped to 32 degrees. By 3 a.m., it hit 25. The house began to die. It started with a loud, terrifying gunshot sound echoing from the kitchen. Brenda screamed. The water inside the imported Italian marble farmhouse, sink's faucet, had frozen solid, expanding and shattering the brass fixture completely. Then came the groans from beneath the floorboards. The radiant heating system, filled with water that was no longer circulating or heated, began to freeze. As the water expanded, it violently ruptured the PEX tubing, locked beneath the expensive imported hardwood floors. The sound of splitting wood and snapping plastic echoed through the dark house like cracking bones. "Bill, we are going to die in here," Brenda sobbed, shivering uncontrollably. They had dragged a mattress into the central hallway, away from the freezing glass, and piled every piece of clothing and bedding they owned on top of themselves. But it wasn't enough. They had no fireplace. They had opted for a purely aesthetic, ventless bioethanol fireplace that produced virtually zero ambient heat. They had no survival gear. They had trusted money and modern technology to protect them, and both had failed spectacularly. Bill lay beside his wife, his teeth chattering so violently he tasted blood where he had bitten his tongue. His toes were entirely numb. He knew the signs of hypothermia. He knew that when the shivering stopped, death was the next stop. As the faint, grey light of dawn attempted to pierce the blizzard on the second day, Bill looked out a small frost-free patch on a reinforced window facing the property line. Through the blinding swirl of snow, he saw it. A steady, defiant plume of grey smoke was rising from the stone chimney of Clara Higgins' cabin. The wind whipped the smoke away instantly, but the source was undeniable. Inside that ugly, scrap wood monstrosity they had mocked and tried to destroy, there was fire. There was heat. "Brenda," Bill croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Brenda, get up. Put your boots on." "I can't," she whimpered, her eyes half closed, lethargy setting in, a terrifying late-stage symptom of freezing to death. "You have to," Bill yelled, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her roughly. "We can't stay here. The house is a freezer. We have to go to Clara's." Brenda stared at him, confused. "The widow? But the woodshed, the garbage. She has a fire, Brenda. Move!" The distance between the Carmichaels' side door and Clara's front porch was exactly 120 yards. On a sunny July afternoon, it was a brisk 1-minute walk. On the morning of December 15th, it was a lethal expedition. Bill wrapped Brenda in a heavy down comforter, secured it with a leather belt, and pulled a ski mask over her face. He donned his own gear, knowing it was woefully inadequate for 70 below wind chills. They stepped out the door, and the storm immediately tried to kill them. The wind hit them like a physical wall of concrete. Brenda was instantly knocked off her feet, tumbling into a snowdrift. Bill dragged her up by her arm, the howling gale drowning out her screams. They couldn't see past their own outstretched hands. The snow was blowing horizontally, stinging their exposed eyes like bird shot. "Keep moving!" Bill roared, though he couldn't even hear his own voice. They waded through waist-deep drifts. Every step was an agonizing, muscle-tearing effort. The cold instantly penetrated their layers, seizing their joints. Midway across the yard, Bill lost his bearing. The whiteout was absolute. Panic, pure and primal, seized his chest. They were going to freeze to death in their own front yard. Then, his gloved hand brushed against something hard and metallic. He blindly felt along the surface. It was corrugated tin, the shed. Clara's ugly, hated shed. Using the patchwork wall as a guide, Bill dragged Brenda along the perimeter. The structure was taking an absolute beating from the wind, groaning and rattling, but it stood firm. It was blocking the worst of the gale, creating a narrow, slightly less violent slipstream along its edge. Finally, they reached the front porch of the cabin. Bill collapsed against the heavy oak door, pounding on it with both fists, leaving smears of blood from his cracked knuckles on the wood. Inside, Clara was stoking the coals when she heard the faint, rhythmic thudding over the roar of the storm. She paused, fireplace poker in hand. She walked to the window and scraped away a patch of frost. 2 figures, bundled and heavily covered in snow, were collapsed on her porch. For a single, fleeting second, Clara remembered the mocking laughter. She remembered the photo on Facebook, the cruel comments, the threats of lawsuits, and the visit from the code enforcer. She remembered the sheer malice with which Bill Carmichael had tried to strip her of her dignity and her home. Then she unlocked the deadbolt and threw the door open. Bill fell inward, dragging Brenda with him. They collapsed onto Clara's braided rug, gasping for air, violently shivering. They looked like refugees, stripped of all their wealth and arrogance, reduced to the raw, biological, desperate need for warmth. Clara didn't say a word about the past. She immediately went into action. "Get those wet coats off them," she commanded, grabbing thick, dry wool blankets from a cedar chest. She helped a weeping Brenda peel off her frozen outer layers. Brenda's lips were blue, her fingers stark white. Bill was in no better shape, his face smeared with frostnip. Clara dragged 2 heavy armchairs directly in front of the roaring wood stove. She guided them into the seats and draped the heavy wool blankets over them. She went to the kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of boiling hot broth. "Drink it slowly," Clara instructed, her voice calm and authoritative. "Don't burn your throats, but get it down. You need internal heat." For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the cabin were the roaring of the wind outside, the crackling of the dry oak in the stove, and the ragged, thawing breaths of the Carmichaels. Slowly, the blue faded from Brenda's lips. The violent shivering subsided into exhausted tremors. Bill sat staring at the dancing flames through the glass door of the stove. He looked around the small, unpretentious cabin. It was immaculate. It was 70 degrees. It was a fortress of life in a sea of death. He slowly turned his head to look at the interior door that led to the shed. He knew what was on the other side. He knew the genius of the dead air space, the sheer utility of the dry wood stacked high, buffering the wind. "Clara," Bill rasped, his voice raw and broken. Clara looked up from her knitting chair, her face unreadable. "Yes, Bill." Tears, unbidden and unfamiliar, welled up in the millionaire's eyes and spilled over his weathered cheeks. "I am so sorry. God, Clara, I am so completely sorry." Brenda sobbed quietly from beneath her wool blanket, burying her face in her hands. "Drink your broth, Bill," Clara said softly, picking up her knitting needles. "The storm is supposed to break by tomorrow morning. We have plenty of wood." The blizzard raged for another 30 hours before finally breaking on the morning of December 17th. When the skies cleared, the devastation was absolute. The county was paralyzed. It took snowplows and emergency crews another full day to reach Oak Haven. When Deputy Miller finally crested Ridge Road in a heavy-duty tracked vehicle, he fully expected to find bodies in the Carmichael estate. He found the glass mansion, a completely destroyed, frozen ruin. The burst pipes had flooded the main floor with 2 inches of water, which had subsequently frozen solid into a skating rink. Every plant was dead. The drywall was cracking. It would require hundreds of thousands of dollars just to gut the first floor. But the Carmichaels weren't dead. The deputy found them sitting comfortably at Clara Higgins's small, scarred kitchen table, eating hot oatmeal and drinking coffee. The dynamic of the mountain had irrevocably changed. Bill Carmichael never filed another complaint. In fact, when the spring thaw finally came, and Clara was out inspecting the minor damage the wind had done to her corrugated tin wall, A massive, flatbed delivery truck rumbled up her driveway. Tom Harrison, the driver, hopped out with a clipboard. Delivery for Clara Higgins, paid in full. Clara watched in shock as Tom began unloading stacks of premium, pressure-treated lumber, high-grade insulation panels, and beautiful cedar siding. Bill walked over from his property line. He looked older, humbler, and distinctly devoid of his usual arrogance. "You let me know if Arthur left any blueprints for a permanent version of that shed, Clara," he said quietly, looking at the ground. "Because I'm hiring a crew to build it for you properly. And then, I'm going to ask them to build one for me, if you don't mind." Clara looked at the lumber, then at Bill. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Arthur always said a good design was meant to be shared, Bill. Let's get to work." Oakhaven never forgot the Great Freeze. The Carmichaels spent 6 months and a fortune repairing their shattered glass mansion, eventually building a solid, sensible windbreak of their own. Clara Higgins remained in her cabin, warm, solvent, and fiercely independent. The scrapwood shed stood for another decade, a testament to Arthur's brilliant design, and a permanent reminder that true wealth isn't what you show the world, but how you weather the storm.